The orphan was small, barefoot, with nothing but a ragged dress and a will to survive. Yet when she found the native girl limping by the riverbank, wounded, alone, bleeding into the current, she did not turn away. With arms too thin for the task, she guided the stranger through the rushing water, each step a battle, each gasp a prayer. By the time they reached the far shore, both were trembling, yet alive. That night, the orphan slept with the wounded girl at her side, not knowing if dawn would bring salvation or death. When the first light touched the cabin walls, the ground shook with hoofbeats. 30 warriors stood outside her door, faces grim, eyes fixed on the child who had saved their own. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The orphan, whom the town had only ever called Clara for lack of a truer name, pressed her small, trembling hand against the rough-hewn wood of the cabin door, her bare toes curling against the dirt-packed floor as if the ground itself could swallow her whole. For beyond that thin barrier of pine boards came the thunderous sound of hooves shifting, warriors breathing, and silence so heavy it seemed to weigh on her chest. She eased the door open just enough for her wide eyes to meet the sight of 30 mounted figures circling like storm clouds around a lonely tree, their paint glinting in the dawn, their rifles resting across saddles, their gazes sharp as the blades strapped to their thighs. Clara's breath hitched as her gaze fixed on the one who slid from his horse with a grace born of command. Tall, broad, shouldered, his braids heavy with beads that clicked in the morning air, his expression carved of stone as his dark eyes flicked past her scrawny form and fixed on the figure she had dragged from death's current only hours before. The injured girl, lying on the crude blanket Clara had spread beside the hearth, stirred faintly, her face pale under the flicker of firelight, her wound bandaged clumsily with strips of Clara's own dress, her breath shallow but steady. The leader stepped closer, his shadow falling across Clara like a cloak, and for a moment she thought he might simply push her aside. But instead he paused, his nostrils flaring as if smelling the smoke. The blood, the faint scent of fear and defiance mingled together. The cabin was small, barely large enough to hold one soul comfortably. Yet now it was crammed with tension and expectation, Clara's heart battering her ribs, her thin frame dwarfed by the bulk of his presence. "Naira," he said, the word rolling from his tongue not as question but as recognition. And Clara realized with a start that the wounded girl had a name, and that name belonged to the man before her. The warriors outside shifted, mutters rippling through them like restless wind, and Clara understood dimly that this was no chance gathering. They had not stumbled upon her cabin. They had come seeking, and the life she had dragged from the river was no ordinary runaway. The leader's gaze fell back on Clara, narrowing, weighing, and she felt the full force of 30 stares boring into her, judging whether she was captor, betrayer, or miracle. Her lips trembled, but no words formed. What excuse could she give? A ragged orphan who had nothing but scraps and stubbornness, who had acted not from bravery but from the raw instinct to save a life when no one else would. The silence stretched until it seemed unbearable, then broke with the creak of floorboards as Naira, her strength flickering like a candle, turned her face toward the doorway, her cracked lips parting to whisper something in her own tongue, a thread of sound that seemed to still the very air. The leader froze, his eyes softening just for a breath, and Clara felt her knees weaken, for she knew then that her choice by the river had carried her across a threshold she could not return from. These warriors had come not as strangers but as kin to the girl she had saved, and now, whether they named her friend or foe, her fate was bound to theirs. The chief's boots pressed into the dirt floor with the weight of inevitability as he stepped fully into the cabin, his shadow swallowing the frail glow of the fire, his gaze sweeping from the pale figure of Naira to the orphan who stood before him, bare feet planted though her knees shook like reeds in the wind. His voice, low and edged with the authority of generations, cut through the silence. "Who carried her?" The words, though spoken in accented English, rang heavy with suspicion, with a demand not only for truth but for proof of courage, and for a moment Clara felt the world tilt beneath her, as if every eye outside, every warrior poised in the saddle, had leaned closer to hear her answer. Her throat tightened, dry as dust, her chest quivered, but she did not shrink. Instead, with a trembling breath, she lifted her chin, her ragged hair falling back from her gaunt face, and though her voice cracked, it did not falter. "I did." The confession hung in the air, a fragile thing, and in the pause that followed it seemed the entire world waited, smoke curling from the fire. The faint rasp of Naira's breathing, the muffled snorts of the horses outside. The chief's eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, narrowed, and he stepped closer still, looming above her like a storm. He reached out, rough fingers tilting her chin upward so her gaze could not flee his, and what he saw there was not strength of body but a will unbroken. A stubborn fire kindled in the hollowness of hunger and abandonment. He let go, his expression unreadable, and turned his head toward the doorway, barking a word in his own tongue. Immediately, the warriors outside rumbled in reply, a wave of disbelief breaking into murmurs that rattled the morning air. Clara's chest throbbed, her small fists clenching at her sides, for though she did not know their words, she understood their meaning. They doubted her. They scorned her claim. They thought no child, barefoot and starving, could carry one of their own through the river's fury. She swallowed, and when the chief turned back, his voice had softened but his gaze grew sharper still. "Why?" he asked, a single word that pierced deeper than any blade. Clara's lips trembled, her mind flashing to the desperate moment when she had seen Naira slumped against the rocks, the blood mingling with the rushing water, the way the river had pulled at her with hands like claws, and how she had felt the terror of letting go. "Because no one else would," she whispered. And though her words were small, they carried a weight beyond her years. The chief studied her a long while, the air thick with judgment, and at last he gave a slow nod, not of acceptance, not yet, but of recognition that a truth lay in her words no mob could erase. He straightened, his presence filling the cabin once more, and spoke again, his voice carrying through the doorway. "She is no enemy." The murmur outside shifted, anger giving way to uneasy silence, and Clara's breath shuddered free. For though her fate remained unwritten, she knew one thing with certainty. She had spoken her truth before 30 warriors, and somehow, impossibly, they had heard her. The cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of silence, the air pressing down so thick that Clara thought even the fire dared not crackle, its embers glowing faintly as if uncertain whether to breathe. Outside, 30 mounted warriors shifted restlessly, their horses stamping and snorting, the leather of saddles creaking as men exchanged glances, astonishment flashing in eyes used to storms and battlefields, disbelief curling their lips at the idea that a child so slight, ribs like bowstrings beneath ragged skin, could have dragged one of their own through a river that had swallowed men twice her size. Their silence was not the quiet of calm, but of wrestling with something greater than understanding, as if courage shown by such a fragile figure disrupted the very order of the world they knew. The chief's gaze lingered on her, sharp and measuring, but he spoke no word, leaving the moment to stretch like a drawn bow. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, her chin still lifted though her body quivered with exhaustion, her arms aching with phantom weight, the memory of Naira's limp form still heavy on her shoulders, water dragging at her legs, blood slick on her palms. She wanted to speak again, to explain herself, but the words tangled in her throat, and so she stood in that silence, trembling yet unbroken, while the warriors studied her as though trying to pierce the truth of her claim through sheer force of will. Slowly, one rider at the edge of the circle leaned forward in his saddle, his face etched with age, and muttered something in a voice that carried just far enough for others to hear. The ripple of murmurs that followed was a wave of disbelief breaking, rolling through the group. Yet beneath it Clara sensed something else, a begrudging awe, a reluctant recognition that perhaps the impossible had been done. Inside, Naira stirred faintly, her cracked lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came, only a weak sigh that seemed to draw every eye back to the cabin, to the frail girl whose life now balanced on the thin thread the orphan had spun with her strength. Clara knelt beside her without thinking, brushing damp hair from her face, and the warriors who could see through the doorway stiffened, for the tenderness in her gesture spoke louder than any words. This was no act of chance, no stumble into duty, but a bond chosen, and that truth unsettled them more than her claim of survival. The silence deepened, heavy, almost unbearable, until Clara thought it might crush her chest. But then she realized something startling. The longer they watched her, the less their eyes burned with hatred. It was not acceptance yet, but a softening, a fracture in the wall of suspicion that had encircled her like iron bars. The chief remained still, his face carved from stone, but his silence carried a different weight now, not dismissal, but contemplation, as if he too wrestled with the dissonance between what his people believed possible and the living truth standing barefoot in front of him. Clara swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat aching, but she refused to look away. For the first time in her life, silence did not mean invisibility, it meant they were listening. Naira stirred where she lay by the fire, her eyelids fluttering against the weight of exhaustion, her chest rising and falling shallowly beneath the makeshift bandages Clara had wrapped with trembling fingers. The cabin still rang with silence. 30 warriors outside, watching, listening, judging, and their chief standing like a carved statue in the doorway, his eyes fixed not on Clara now but on the wounded girl who had only barely been dragged back from death. For a moment it seemed she would drift again into unconsciousness, but then her lips parted and her voice spilled into the air, a sound weak yet carrying more power than a gunshot. She spoke in her own tongue, each word fragile as glass, yet cutting sharper than steel. And the cadence of her speech rolled out across the circle of men who had doubted, their bodies shifting in their saddles as they strained to catch every syllable. Naira told them of the river's fury, of how the water had clutched at her like talons, dragging her down while her blood painted the current, and how, when she had given herself to despair, a child with no shoes and no family had taken hold of her and refused to let go. Her words painted a picture of the orphan's thin arms shaking with effort, her knees scraping against stone, her cries carried away by the roar of the current, yet still she had pulled, stumbled, and dragged until both of them reached the far shore alive. The warriors exchanged glances, disbelief cracking, for though they had mocked the notion that a small girl could carry such a burden, they could not deny the testimony of their own blood. Clara sat frozen, unable to understand each word but sensing the shift in the room, the way the men leaned forward, the way the silence changed from suspicion to reluctant awe. The chief's gaze flickered, his face still carved of stone, yet in his eyes a spark revealed that even he could not ignore the truth rising from Naira's lips. When her strength faltered, Naira turned her head, her gaze finding Clara's small form by the hearth, and her mouth curved into a faint smile, a smile lined with pain yet filled with gratitude, a smile that said more clearly than language, "You saved me when the world would have left me to die." Clara's heart clenched, her chest aching as she met the gaze, realizing that in that moment their bond was sealed in front of all who had come to judge her. The murmurs outside shifted again, disbelief giving way to respect, their whispers now heavy with acknowledgement that courage can dwell in even the frailest body. The chief lifted his chin at last, scanning the circle of his men, and though he did not speak, the silence he commanded carried a new weight. No longer was the orphan merely an intruder or a suspect, she was the child whose stubborn will had defied the river, whose truth had been spoken through Naira's own breath, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt seen not as a burden but as something greater, the fragile vessel of a courage no one could deny. The chief stood tall in the doorway, the dawn painting his shoulders in amber light, his expression unreadable to all but the most watchful eye. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried with it the authority of generations, rolling out into the silence with the weight of a mountain. "This child is under our protection." The words, delivered in both his tongue and in broken English so that Clara would understand, cracked through the air like thunder, reverberating not only through the 30 warriors encircling the cabin but through Clara's very bones. For in her short life she had never known the shelter of family, never heard a voice claim her as kin or as ward, and the sound of it struck her harder than any blow. For a moment she did not believe him, her lips parting in disbelief, her heart stammering as though trying to catch up to the meaning. And then, like a door opening where none had ever stood, the reality settled upon her. She, Clara the orphan, the girl who had lived in shadows and scraps, now belonged to something greater than herself. The warriors shifted in their saddles, some nodding solemnly, others muttering with unease, for the decree was no small thing. Protection meant blood spilled if threatened, meant enemies turned to ash if they dared cross, meant that this ragged barefoot girl was no longer prey but shielded beneath the wings of a people bound by honor. Clara's throat worked as she glanced from the chief to Naira, who lay weak but smiling faintly, her dark eyes filled with pride, as though she had willed this very moment into being. For Clara, who had wandered nameless through towns where doors slammed in her face, who had begged scraps from tables only to be kicked away, who had felt the bite of loneliness sharper than hunger, the chief's declaration rang like a bell calling her out of exile, and she realized with a sudden fierce clarity that she was no longer invisible. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, seemed to swell with life, the presence of the warriors outside transforming it into a fortress rather than a prison. And Clara's gaze darted to the fire, its flames licking higher as if in agreement. Yet the gift was not without its shadows. She felt the weight of expectation settle on her thin shoulders, the knowledge that to be protected also meant to be tested, to be worthy of the shield she had been given. The chief's eyes lingered on her a long moment, as if to remind her that protection was no charity but a bond, one that would demand strength from her as much as it offered. Still, as the words echoed in her ears, Clara felt a fragile joy bloom inside her chest, tentative but real, the kind of joy that comes when a heart long starved is given its first taste of warmth. She pressed a hand against the rough wood of the table as if to steady herself, the world tilting with this new truth, and though fear still lingered, it no longer chained her. Outside, the warriors lowered their rifles, their horses shifting in the dust, and Clara knew that for the first time, she would sleep not as a forgotten orphan but as one claimed, one named, one seen. The news reached town before the sun had fully set, carried on the tongues of riders who claimed they had seen 30 Apache warriors encircling the orphan's crooked little cabin, their chief standing like a sentinel at her door, and the whispers spread faster than prairie fire in dry grass, twisting with every retelling until the settlers could scarcely separate fact from fancy. Some said the child had bewitched the natives, others swore she had been marked by spirits, and still others muttered darkly that no good could come from a barefoot girl defended by so many rifles. And as the rumors tangled, the town itself seemed to split into factions, those who whispered she was blessed, chosen by some divine hand, and those who spat she was cursed, a magnet for ruin that would draw trouble straight into their homes. In the saloon, men hunched over whiskey muttered about savagery disguised as protection, their suspicion brewing hotter than the liquor burning in their throats, while women gathered at wells and market stalls to shake their heads, pity and fear mingling as they hissed that the child would bring soldiers or raiders down upon them all. Clara, venturing into town for the first time since the river, felt the sting of eyes following her every step, their gazes as sharp as knives, some filled with awe, others with loathing, and she tugged her ragged dress tighter about herself as if cloth could shield her from their judgment. The sheriff, a broad man with a permanent squint carved into his sun-baked face, intercepted her outside the general store, his hand heavy on her shoulder, his voice low but hard as granite. "Listen close. Girl, keep your distance from them. Folks here won't suffer a child who beds down with savages, not when the army's still watching. You'll find yourself out on the street, or worse." His words struck like a lash, and though Clara's chin wavered, she met his gaze with the same stubbornness that had carried her through the river, refusing to let him see her fear. Yet inside, her stomach twisted, because she knew his warning was not just bluster but truth. The settlers feared what they did not understand, and a child shielded by Apache warriors was a thing they could neither control nor abide. As she walked back along the dusty street, whispers trailed her like shadows, some voices calling her a miracle, others a curse, and the divide widened with each step, as though the town itself could not decide whether to claim her or cast her out. When she reached the ridge and looked back, she saw curtains twitching, faces disappearing behind shutters, and she realized with a pang that whatever home she might find among the settlers was slipping from her grasp. Yet when she turned toward the horizon, she thought of Naira's faint smile, of the chief's voice declaring her under their protection. And though doubt gnawed at her, a quiet certainty stirred too, that belonging was not something given by rumor or law, but something chosen, fought for, and earned. The moon hung pale and swollen above the plains when the first soft knock rattled the orphan's thin cabin door, a sound so gentle she almost thought it was the wind teasing the boards. But then it came again, measured, deliberate, carrying a weight of intent that made her rise from her straw pallet with a racing heart, her bare feet pressing against the cold floorboards as she moved toward the sound. When she cracked the door, her breath caught, For standing in the silvery wash of moonlight was the limping girl she had saved, her form frail yet proud, supported by two silent warriors whose dark eyes gleamed with an unreadable mix of gratitude and solemn duty. And though the orphan's throat tightened with fear of discovery, she stepped back, letting them enter, because instinct told her that kindness once given was now being returned. The warriors, towering and still, set down a bundle wrapped in hide upon her rickety table, and when she peeled it open, her eyes widened at the sight of roasted meat, dried corn, and a small pouch of herbs whose fragrance filled the room with something sharp and healing, the kind of medicine settlers whispered of but could never replicate. The limping girl lowered herself with effort onto a stool, her hand brushing the orphan's arm in a gesture that needed no words, for her eyes carried the depth of a thank you spoken from the soul. And in that moment the child, who had known only hunger and suspicion from townsfolk, felt her ribs loosen as if for the first time she was not merely surviving but being cared for. As she ate, urged on by the girl's nods and the faintest smile ghosting her lips, the warriors remained silent sentinels, their presence heavy yet protective, and when she tried to offer them a piece of bread in return, they shook their heads, one pointing to the hearth, then to the sky, as if to remind her that even small flames needed shielding from darkness. The medicine was pressed into her hands with a tenderness she did not expect, the herbs meant to keep her strong through the winter storms, and though no language bridged them fully, she understood their meaning. She was not forgotten, not alone. As the night deepened, the girl whispered a single word in her tongue, one the orphan could not understand but whose tone wrapped her heart in warmth like a blanket. And for the first time in years, she felt a smile stretch her face, awkward and trembling but real, a smile born not of desperation or pretense but of something rarer belonging. When at last the warriors rose to leave, their shadows long against the flickering firelight, the limping girl lingered at the threshold, turning back once to lift her chin in silent promise before vanishing into the hush of night, leaving behind not only food and medicine but a thread of connection that would carry the orphan through whatever trials the frontier would hurl next. For though she was still small and alone in the eyes of the world, in that quiet cabin her spirit knew she had been seen, valued, and perhaps for the first time, chosen. The whispers in town had always been sharp enough to cut, but now they grew teeth, gnashing in every corner of the saloon and at every water trough, twisting into something darker, something that smelled of smoke and blood. Men who once smirked at the orphan's ragged dress now spat on the ground at the mention of her name, as though she carried disease, and they told themselves that her connection to the warriors was proof of evil, a pact too unnatural to be borne by decent folk. In truth, their hatred was nothing more than jealousy turned sour. For what man among them could claim to be guarded by 30 riders who would die at a single glance? Yet it festered, growing hotter with each drink poured and each tale retold, until reason became a stranger and cruelty sharpened like a knife against stone. The sheriff, weary and cautious, told the men to leave it, muttering that the child was no threat so long as she kept to her cabin, but his words carried no weight in a place where pride was coin and envy was law. By dusk, clusters of townsfolk gathered near the blacksmith's forge, voices low, eyes darting, speaking of setting things right, before the valley lost itself to savagery, and in their mouths, the girl became not a child but a symbol of doom, something that must be driven out if the town hoped to keep its place in the world. Women, too, whispered harsh prayers as she passed, clutching their children closer, muttering about curses and omens, while boys emboldened by their father's venom hurled pebbles at her back and laughed when she flinched, their cruelty a mirror of the fear that poisoned their homes. The orphan, too young to understand every barb, could still feel the heat of their hatred like coals pressed against her skin, and though she lowered her eyes, hurried her steps, and clutched her meager scraps tight, she could not escape the sense that each face in town was a wall closing in, each shadow stretching toward her cabin with darker intent. Soon ropes and lanterns began to appear in men's wagons, carried openly as though the plan no longer needed secrecy, and in the smoke of their pipes they spoke of fire, of flushing her out like vermin, of teaching both her and her protectors that this land would not be claimed by a barefoot child. Yet when the orphan lay awake in her small bed, the straw rustling beneath her, she remembered the limping girl's hand on her arm, the bundle of food and medicine left on her table, the word whispered in a tongue she could not understand, but that somehow wrapped around her heart like a promise, and she clung to those memories as if they were armor. Fear pressed down on her small chest, yes, but alongside it rose something fierce, a quiet defiance that told her she was not merely prey waiting for wolves. She had carried another across the river, when her own body had nearly broken. She had faced death in the form of blood and rushing water, and though she trembled in the dark, she whispered to herself that she would not run. Let them come with their ropes, their torches, their jeers and spittle, she would not yield, because even the smallest child, when bound by gratitude and courage, could stand taller than the men who called themselves strong. The night came down heavy, thick with the scent of smoke and dust. The orphan curled in her small cabin listening to the crackle of torches outside. Each hiss of flame against the wind, a drumbeat of dread echoing through her ribs. And when she dared to peek through the crooked shutters, she saw them, men from town, their faces half-lit and twisted, ropes dangling from their saddles like snakes ready to strike. Their laughter too loud, too brittle, to hide the ugliness of what they intended. Her small hands clutched the table's edge until her knuckles ached, and for a heartbeat she thought of running, thought of slipping through the back into the dark fields. But her legs would not move, as though the earth itself pinned her in place, forcing her to face what cruelty had been set upon her. The men shouted for her to come out, their voices rising in ugly chorus, promising that a fire would cleanse her cabin, that no warriors could protect her now. And as the flames bobbed closer, she felt her heart seize until, beneath the jeering, another sound began to build, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling over the plains. Hoofbeats. The rhythm deepened, multiplied, until it grew into a roar that rattled windows and sent the mob's torches shivering in their holders. And out of the night, shadows emerged, 30 riders, their silhouettes cutting across the moonlit ridge like a tide of iron and will, their eyes glinting with the same fierce loyalty she had once glimpsed by the river. The torches wavered, the men's laughter faltered, for the warriors did not come with hesitation but with the precision of storm clouds sweeping across the horizon, circling the cabin in silence, rifles gleaming cold in the firelight, their presence a wall of defiance against the mob's cruelty. The orphan's breath caught in her throat as she pressed her forehead against the wood, watching in awe as the men who had called her curse now scattered like startled cattle, some dropping their torches in their scramble to flee, others pulling their hats low to hide their shame, their bravado crumbling to dust beneath the weight of 30 pairs of unyielding eyes. One by one, the attackers retreated, swallowed by the night, until only the hiss of dying torches remained in the dirt. And when the silence fell, it was not empty, but thick with something greater. Protection, belonging, the unspoken vow of a people who had chosen to stand with her when no one else would. The warriors did not cheer, did not taunt the retreating men. They simply sat their horses in a solemn ring, faces carved from stone, as though declaring by their presence alone that the child was no burden, no blight, but kin. The orphan pressed her palms together, trembling with relief so sharp it stung. And for the first time, she dared to lift her chin high, knowing that whatever the town whispered tomorrow, whatever venom they spat, they had seen her shield, her family, her truth, and they had fled from it. When the chief finally raised his hand, the circle of riders shifted, their horses moving as one, and he gave a single nod toward the cabin, a gesture of recognition that needed no words. She understood it as surely as she understood her own heartbeat. She was not alone. The first fingers of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the plains in muted gold, and the orphan, who had known only hunger and silence for as long as her memory could stretch, stepped into the doorway of her crooked cabin, her ragged dress stirring in the morning breeze as if the dawn itself had chosen to clothe her in something new. Behind her, the ashes of abandoned torches smoldered in the dirt, reminders of the mob that had come to erase her and had instead been scattered like leaves before the storm, and before her stood the 30 warriors who had answered a call she had never spoken aloud, their horses standing proud, their faces solemn yet softened by the light of day. The chief dismounted with a slow grace, his braids falling across his shoulders, his shadow stretching long until it touched her bare feet, and when his hand came to rest upon her small shoulder it was not heavy, not a burden, but steady as the earth itself. anchoring her trembling heart in a way no words ever had, and his voice, low but resonant, carried through the chill of morning. You carried one of ours. Now we carry you. The words wrapped around her like a blanket, simple yet vast. And though she had no mother left to whisper comfort, no father to guide her hand, she felt something stir in her chest, an ache, a warmth, a recognition that this, at last, was family. Tears she did not know she had been holding welled and slipped down her dirt-streaked cheeks, glistening in the dawn. But she did not wipe them away, for they were not shameful. They were proof that she was seen, proof that she mattered, proof that courage could carve a place in the world even for the smallest and most forgotten. The warriors watched in silence, but their silence was not cold like the townsfolk's scorn. It was a silence filled with respect, a silence that spoke of battles fought, losses endured, and the strength of a bond chosen freely. The limping girl, now steadier on her feet, stepped forward to clasp the orphan's hand, her eyes shining with pride as if to say, "You are one of us." For the orphan, whose life had been defined by absent parents, absent protection, absent kindness, this moment was a presence so overwhelming it rooted her where she stood, and as the sun climbed higher, warming her skin, she understood that belonging was not given by bloodlines or names carved in Bibles, but forged in the crucible of courage, in the choice to act when fear said to run. The valley spread wide before her, endless and harsh, yet it no longer looked like a wasteland meant to swallow her. It looked like a home, because home was not wood or stone but the people who stood beside you when the fire burned hottest. She raised her chin, no longer shrinking, no longer curling herself small to disappear, and in her chest a vow blossomed. She would walk forward not as an orphan, but as kin, as one carried by a people who had seen her heart and claimed her as their own. And so, as the riders turned their horses toward the rising sun, the orphan stepped down from the threshold to follow, her bare feet striking the earth with a new rhythm, each step echoing not of loneliness but of belonging. For the first time, truly, she was not alone.